Okay, did I find the buttons and is it working?
I can hear you and see you.
Excellent.
You're aging like all of us, Rick. Okay.
Absolutely, absolutely. I am Rick Harnish. I'm the executive director of the High Speed Rail Alliance. So we've been in business now for 30 years. Have made some good progress. I'm really excited about the position that we're in today. Um, this is, I've seen since I started in history and in my own experience since I've been in this, we get a little bit closer about every 10 years. And I think this year is the year that we can make, or in the next couple of years, this is when we can really make something very exciting happen. So I'm really happy about where we're positioned. Wisconsin is very well positioned to take advantage of the federal funds that are available. There's some work to be done to persuade Madison to actually take advantage of that opportunity. But it's a really exciting opportunity. And after some background for those who aren't familiar with our philosophy, let's call it. I'll give some background on the philosophy and then an example to follow. And then we can talk about how to help local leaders throughout Wisconsin take advantage of this great opportunity to reconnect business centers to each other and to Chicago. Quick brief why we're in this. We believe that when people talk to each other face to face, things happen better. It's more productive, closer ties, better family ties. We are spread out across the land, and anything that we can do to make it easier, safer, and more affordable to travel is really key to making our communities healthy, safe, and productive. And trains have the advantage of you can actually talk to each other face to face while you're traveling, like this family is on a TGV somewhere in France. In the process, even though we'll be increasing travel overall, we'll be reducing carbon emissions and providing the infrastructure to store your car wherever you want to go is really expensive. It's placing an unmeasured burden on our local communities. So the more that we can get people traveling around without a car, the better our local finances will be. In order to think about this, we've been thinking about point-to-point city pairs, maybe routes, but you really have to think in terms of networks in order to understand how the whole thing fits together. Where you need to invest the most in order to have the most impact, and also how to phase it. And so we need to persuade the local regions to have integrated transit plans, states to have their own integrated plan, regions, and then national. Trains are incredibly flexible. You can put together pieces in different ways to do different things depending upon your local assets and your local needs. But to simplify it, we've broken it down into shared use lines, which are passenger trains operating no faster than 80 with heavy freight trains, regional lines where you take an existing line and rebuild it to be focused on passenger trains like the Northeast Corridor, or new high-speed lines where you take discrete segments in very specific places based on the network plan, and you can really juice the whole network with one segment in the right place. There's lots of different types of trains. High-speed trains can go on regional tracks and high-speed tracks. They don't work very well on shared use tracks. Most other trains can go on shared use and regional. So what we need is, again, state plans to figure out how these pieces come together. We are the High Speed Rail Alliance. Our goal is to create a national program where new high-speed lines really cause a tipping point in the way people travel. This is the best analysis that I have found of where we probably as a country should have already built high-speed lines. But I bring this up to point out that, there's this discussion about whether we do shared use lines or we do high-speed lines. In my view, you can't do one without the other. Happy to talk at a much more in-depth presentation of how that all fits together. But to understand what we need to do and what we can do in the Midwest, we really need to start with California because they are 30 years ahead of us. In 1990, the voters passed a big bond act funded in large part by gas taxes that expanded transit systems across the state, including Amtrak. So if we had done this like California did, we'd already have 16 trains a day between Chicago and Milwaukee and 5 to 10 trains a day between Chicago and Minneapolis, and probably 8 or so to Green Bay. So it's a really exciting system. They've been very innovative in terms of governance, in terms of funding, and they have driven the long distance rolling stock market for many years. They have already an integrated network where you can use a combination of buses and trains to get almost anywhere in the state on one ticket. And this is that network. So it really is very extensive. And it's surprising how good it is when we think of California as the lover of automobiles, right? But I want to point out in this map here, there are 2 missing links from the Central Valley to the southern end of Silicon Valley and from the Central Valley down into the high desert and the LA basin. The only way you can justify closing those links is running a lot of trains with a lot of people. And in order to do that, you need to go really fast and really frequently. So what they've done is, well, I'm sorry, I'm skipping ahead a little bit. Frequency is key. So in the Central Valley, that looks much like the Midwest today, there's 6 trains a day. Right before COVID, they were about to go to 9. So it's a really long run. It's almost as long as the Minneapolis to Chicago run in terms of time. And they were going to have 9 trains a day before COVID. They're still planning on ramping up to that. Concurrently, they've been designing these new high-speed lines. They've done it segment by segment, and they've actually got the entire system environmentally improved, and they can go after federal money much more aggressively than we can because they have all these shared use projects that are in the process, and they have these key segments of high-speed line. But what they finally did, unfortunately, they did these efforts separately. They brought them together in 2018 and said, we need to make this all work as a single system that connects the entire state. They actually did a timetable for 2040 where they said, at these stations, these trains will meet every hour on the hour. At these stations, trains will meet every 2 hours, et cetera. And then they can figure out how to phase the network. And when you think of it in this case, the Central Valley is the best place to start. If you think about just a flat map, then it doesn't look right. But here's the most important piece of this. When you think holistically like this, their base case in this was 2010. These are the counties that go from essentially north to south. And you can see ridership in between these counties. And I want to point out here, Fresno shows 0 ridership, even though Fresno's a very busy station and compared to what we do in the Midwest. It's just that this purple graph over here doesn't work if you have Fresno show up. So the way they were going, where everybody was doing their own thing, would have been a huge boost. And rural communities in the northern part of the state would have started seeing much better bus service because the volume goes up overall. But with a coordinated system, suddenly you really truly are transforming the way people travel, and these rural communities get tremendously better service because you've got so much volume on the south end feeding into those bus lines. It's a tenfold increase in ridership. There's where we should be thinking. There's where we'll have a true impact. And it is possible if we put together the right program. So based on conversations we've had and what's in the plan and who is at the local level showed interest, we put together this map of a potential long-term network plan for Wisconsin. And those solid light blue is what's already in the rail plan. So it's not too much of a stretch to think about actually having this. The three missing links in my view are we really need to extend up to the UP. There needs to be a cross-state route and Madison, Janesville to Chicago with the potential for a stop at O'Hare is I think a very exciting asset for the state. So in my view, if we start with this framing, we can start to have a conversation about trains and buses being a statewide issue as opposed to a Milwaukee and Madison versus the rest of the state issue. And this gets me very excited because, you can start to implement this very quickly. If the state were to subsidize the existing bus routes to run more frequent service, then you can start to have an immediate impact in the northern parts of the state right away without doing much track work. It's a matter of buying buses and paying somebody to run them. And that's an easy win. On the rail side, if you narrow it down to kind of what I would see as easy things to do, it basically comes down to extending the Hiawatha, which we already know is very successful, running more frequencies on it, perhaps on a different route to avoid a serious bottleneck that there is in northern Illinois, but running more frequencies on the Hiawatha and extending it to Green Bay, to St. Paul, and to Madison. Certainly the additional train on the Empire Builder is an exciting step. It's frustrating that the rolling stock isn't available to run that train today, but that's something as a national effort, we need to figure out how to get a much more robust rolling stock supply chain. There should be additional frequencies on that route on top of those two. But in terms of creating something closer to a regional line and really getting fast, frequent service, and the need to get Eau Claire in, I think this becomes a very exciting discussion to have politically about how we move this forward. I just wanted to point out for those who don't know, the bipartisan infrastructure law not only put in a little bit of money, and to rail advocates, it seems like a lot of money, but when it really comes down to it for a country the size of ours, it is a little bit, and it provides the foundation for in 3 or 4 years when they reauthorize the bill again, we need to boost it up again. We need to see that as the floor, we're going bigger. But the other important thing is they've directed the FRA to create a process for creating a pipeline, which has never existed before. And that's a really critical piece of making an ongoing program work, because you have to have the plans in place to get the money. And if you do get the money, you better have the plans in place to take care of it right away, right? So this is the current process. Systems planning is let's create a network plan that's over there in purple. Project planning is looking at specific routes or perhaps specific stations. Currently, there is an open competition. That's not really the right word to use, but an application process where the deadline is on Friday for becoming part of the Corridor ID program. And that first phase there in orange is 100% federal funding to lay out the basic structure of what a corridor will look like. The next step, if the state chooses to move, is to actually start doing the design work, service development plan. That's a 90% federal grant should the state decide to move forward. And then federal design, final design, environmental, 80% federal money, construction, 80%. So what we've got here in terms of a timeline is we've got about a year or two where it's 100% federal money. Now, I would argue that the state should start doing significantly more than what the federal is doing, but we don't really need the legislature to do anything for the next 2 years. So essentially what we've got is a 2-year window to really ramp up a coalition of really engaged local citizens that are really going to push for this, elected leaders across the state who get the vision of the statewide rail plan and their role in it and how to make it happen, and building a strong business community coalition. And that's what's going to make this successful in 2025. It's a lot of legwork right now, a lot of wearing out your shoes, going to talk to people, and it works. We've demonstrated that it works before. It works in every other issue. That's what you need to do. You need to get out and get to the people. You need to educate them face to face. You need to get them to sign on to agreements of support, show up at the right times, etc. That takes essentially a full-time person to do all of that work. But it's going to be well worth the investment, because imagine if you come into 2025 and because the Madison project is essentially already designed, the designs just have to be refreshed and the environmental clearance has to be refreshed. Imagine in 2025, the legislature appropriates at least a 20% match for construction. The money is there at the federal level. You can get construction going right away. Imagine in 2025, there's an exciting service development plan developed for Green Bay and for Eau Claire, and you're ready to go to design and construction, and you've got the legislature excited about doing that, and you've got the legislature excited about buying some buses and running them to the communities that need it the most, or to get service started on the route like Eau Claire, so that you're building a market as you go. That to me is a really exciting program that we can get around, work together to make happen and really go. We have a challenge. Folks were a little intimidated because the majority leader of the Senate and the Speaker of the House came out pretty negative a couple months ago. That's fine. That shows that this is an important issue, because you don't comment on issues that aren't important. We think that there is a strong case to be made for actually overcoming their objections and making it happen. And politically, if you look at the Joint Finance Committee where the money is spent, and you look at those kind of 3 core routes, you are touching most of the members of the Joint Finance Committee. Add some buses to Dubuque, add some buses up to Duluth or someplace, and you've got something that impacts the entire state in the first phase. So let's figure out how to go out and meet with these folks that need to be met with, build the coalition, get people working together as a group, and in 2025, come in strong and get the legislature to appropriate the money that's needed to be appropriated. So that was a really quick explanation. Happy to set up a separate meeting with people who want to talk in more detail. Or if you haven't already signed our federal petition, you can do it at highspeedrail.us, and that'll put you on our email list so that you can keep in touch with the progress as it moves forward. So thank you again for having me.
Thanks, Rick. I actually do have one question that came in from Larry Roof, and I will read it. Larry wants to know what will happen to Amtrak's plans for better connections through Chicago Union Station now that its CHIP funding proposal was turned down. Any thoughts or comments, Rick?
So Amtrak has a group of projects called the Chicago Hub Improvement Program. We have long promoted a concept called Crossrail Chicago, and CHIP is kind of the first steps. So, you know, if you're familiar with Spinal Tap, the Amtrak CHIP proposal, it is about 3 and we're at about 11. But they overlap entirely. So they put in an application for mega grant. They weren't really, that really wasn't the right program for what they want to do. But we're very excited that they made the application and they're being aggressive about going after funding. They already got a small piece in a Chrissy grant for Union Station improvements. Really, the right place for those programs is a program called the Federal State Partnership. And so they have split those grants up into 4 sub-grants, and they have are going to submit those into the Federal State Partnership. The most critical one being, you know, Union Station is not only an unpleasant place to catch a train, it's an unsafe place to catch the train. So it's urgent that we fix those problems. And I think it's very highly likely they will get that money. And then they need to buy some new yard space. And they need to build a connection directly from Union Station to the Rock Island and to the CN along the lake. And that's not as far along as the other thing. So we're still moving is the key.
All right, I do have another question that came in the question and answer, and this is from Representative Lori Palmieri. Hopefully I pronounced her last name correctly. As a new member of the legislature and soon to be former mayor in Oshkosh, what suggestions do you have on how to bring a brief presentation to the freshman caucus, like a lunch and learn perhaps? Any thoughts?
Yeah, talk to Chris Ott and we will get that scheduled. I'm very happy to come up and do that and invite some of, and, you know, have others clearly involved in that, like Scott. And
this is from George Affeld. Is there any doubt that Governor Walker's canceling of the high-speed rail is Wisconsin, was that a terrible decision for growth in the state?
It was a horrible decision. If he hadn't done that, there would be trains to Madison today, and they would be lightweight, high acceleration tilting trains, and Wisconsin would be a leader. And the University of Wisconsin-Madison would be in a much more competitive place. What a horrible thing that was.
I guess one question I'd like to ask you, Rick, when you look at Illinois' state program, you know, for state-supported passenger rail and things that they're doing in Illinois, how do you think Illinois compares with Wisconsin or say Michigan or other states around the country, you know, when it comes to implementing new routes or expanding services or basically creating a more, you know, interactive system? Boy,
I would like Illinois to be a lot more aggressive. So certainly we've had multiple routes that the state has funded with Amtrak service for many, many years. We started to make some significant progress with the Chicago to St. Louis Corridor Improvement Program and the Englewood Flyover and such. We've lost our mojo. It's time to, we need Illinois to do what we're talking about California having done, because you can't do any of this in a real meaningful way in Michigan, Indiana, Ohio, or Iowa, or Wisconsin if Illinois isn't the leader. So we need to really amp up those efforts.
All right, I do have a question that came in through the chat box. This is from David Wheeler. He would like to know, are there any comparison data on canceled flight service from Chicago to Green Bay and Minneapolis that would highlight the importance of rail service?
Unfortunately, we don't have the data, but one thing I want to point out is trains, when done right, are very frequent. So, if you've got 3 round trips a day by plane from Green Bay to Chicago, you should have probably 8 plus or minus from Green Bay to Chicago. Because in order to serve the intermediate communities properly, and many other things, so that becomes much more viable than having to sit around and waiting for that small plane that may or may not fly that day. So frequent train service really, it's not just the reliability, it's the frequency.
All right, and then I have another question that came in from Ethan Johnson. What role do you see private high-speed rail initiatives such as Brightline's project in Florida and California and Nevada having in high-speed rail development in the United States?
Certainly, it's going to need to be a mix of private and public. So companies like Brightline have the advantage of having a real deadline and the need to make decisions in a timely manner and balance issues as you go. So one of the problems with public works in general is that if you don't have a strong executive that truly cares about getting that project done, decisions tend not to get made quickly. So private industry has that advantage. And we've seen that with Brightline in Florida and Brightline West. In terms of like going to Green Bay, the state is going to need to invest substantially in privately owned track. And the Canadian National is going to have to see those trains as a very valued customer. And so private industry has a huge role to play in the shared use services, but it's a mix. But you can't do it without public involvement. Brightline in Florida would not work if it weren't for the true high-speed rail plan that was put together by the state of Florida, because that's the mechanism they used for using the highway rights of way. And Orlando Airport, because of the high-speed plan, had right-of-way reserved for both the tracks and the station and the maintenance facility. And the same thing on the west. The right-of-way is going to be publicly owned, and Nevada is going to put in some significant public investment into that line.
All right, and before we wrap things up here, I just had one question for you, Rick. Do you see in the future the U.S. airlines maybe working more collaboratively with Amtrak or regional rail, especially in cases where you're going distances, say like from DC up to New York or Philadelphia, where rail or higher speed rail or high speed rail might make more sense versus getting in an airline? I mean, it seems like there's cooperation a lot in Europe with that. I just didn't know what your perspective, long range planning for here in the U.S. Any thoughts?
Well, somebody's got to build the tracks and somebody's got to build the stations. And airlines don't build infrastructure. They work with public companies to help finance public infrastructure. So we're not going to see leadership from the airlines. If there's good frequent service, the airline certainly will work with the railroad. The best example of that is at Frankfurt, where the German airline and Deutsche Bahn are working incredibly closely together, but they have the infrastructure in place to really make it work right. So we have to drive the states to make the infrastructure work.
This comes from David Wheeler. He wants to know, have previous studies done by the trucking industry that highlight I-43 and the I-41 congestion and delay data, would it show that more transportation service would be needed to Green Bay?
I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with that, but certainly it would, in my view, it'd be much less expensive to double track the entire railroad from Marionette to Milwaukee, so that the CN can run more frequent trains, than it would be to continue the expansion plan that Wisconsin is continuing to do. So it's a much better use of public funds to invest in double tracking essentially all of the main routes in Wisconsin.
All right, thanks, Rick.